there were stories that I was like so emotionally distraught with. There were 2 times where my wife essentially died on me, but still it's like gut wrenching to put out and to like give a play by play. Like, I just feel like, oh my gosh, I'm vomiting with this intensity. Like, who wants to read this? This is awful.
That is the voice of Jim Barnard. He's a coach, speaker, and author, and it's that last title that we will be focusing on for this episode of the Nook Podcast. My name is Steven, and it is such an honor to welcome you today as we continue in this Maker series. More about that in just a moment. If you ever have any questions or comments about this show, drop me an email. The address is steven@nookpodcast.com. That is always included in the show notes, along with a link to Buy Me a Coffee, which is a secure and simple way for you to support this show financially. There is a list of costs to keep this show going, and I lack the proper words in the English that I am limited to thank those of you who have donated. It really means a lot. As I was planning this series, I knew that I wanted to feature an author. I just didn't know which one. And in all honesty, I was running out of time and getting a little angsty about it. And then God did what he does so well. He connected me with a brother that I now consider a friend, who just so happened to release a book last year. What I appreciated immediately is that Jim didn't just write a book to write a book. This is a hard story about dealing with his wife's chronic illness for the last 15 years. Countless surgeries, unbelievable medical bills, and 2 near-death experiences. And yet, Jim and Alicia have learned to find hope even in the deepest struggles. Regardless of what kind of challenges you are dealing with, I believe that you will find some encouragement in this conversation with Jim Barnard. Any questions from you before we just kind of plow in?
No, that's cool. I like for you to say, "Oh, I found an author." Like, that's almost weird for me to hear you say. You know, like I wrote a book. It's self-published and it's doing well on Amazon, but it's still a new adventure for me. So
sure.
I'm starting the process of writing book 2, which is crazy. So like trying to solidify myself, I guess, in this world.
Yeah.
It's a different thing, but yeah, I guess I'm an author. So I'm excited to be that.
Well, then could we just dive in right there? My whole month is about makers. And I'm guessing that just by what you just said, author was maybe nothing on your radar some time ago. How did it even become? And we've got a whole lot to dive into with regarding the content in this book. But
yeah,
if you went back a few years and somebody told you you're going to be a published author, what would your response have been?
I would have said, "Oh yeah, that's hilarious." Like, I would have loved to hear that. That would have been awesome, but I wouldn't have believed them at all. The reason I started writing this whole silly book was I was desperate. It was an act of desperation. So, you know, my story is kind of unique. My wife has a rare chronic illness where it's called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. And if you've ever seen a contortionist that can bend their joints in any direction, she's got that same disease. She just doesn't have this cool version. That's what we call it, because it's not really cool.
I'm only laughing out of discomfort. My goodness.
Yeah. It's really not that cool because I know it can be painful, but at least you've got cool party tricks that you can, entertain your friends with. But Alicia's version is located in her abdomen, so everything in her core is loosey-goosey. There's most of her organs have prolapsed or fallen out of place. There's cow tissue and meshing and tacks, keeping things where it's supposed to be. And her digestive system just has no muscle tone pushing food through. She's a wreck. And if it just stopped there, that'd be bad enough. But neurologically, she's a mess. Her immune system's wrecked. It's pretty crazy. So the reason I started writing this was Alicia, for 15 years after we got married and she got sick, it's been downhill ever since. Like she's gone straight downhill. I mean, she's 5'8" and weighs like 67 pounds. She is skin and bones. Yeah.
Wow.
It's terrible. But I started writing because there was a therapy that we found called IVIG that helped her more than anything that we have found over the last 15 years. It gave her a nice season of plateau where like she wasn't gaining any health, but she wasn't losing. Like it gave her, some stability. And one day we got a notification from the insurance company saying, hey, we're no longer going to pay for this coverage or for this therapy anymore because it's no longer medically necessary, which was crushing to me. I'm like, she's doing reasonably well.
Wow.
Like it's all accurate. Like she's not getting as many surgeries. There's not as many nights in the hospital, like all this stuff that we've gotten used to. We've kind of found a place of reasonable health. So I understand the logic, but we need this. Like, this is why she's doing well. Don't take this away from us. So she was pretty distraught. I was really upset. And I just started to like, okay, we got to scrap together the money it's going to take to fund this like therapy for her. So we started asking the questions, how much is this going to cost for us to pay for it privately? And the answer was, well, at least $300,000 a year.
Oh my gosh.
And Stephen,
okay, that's nowhere near the number I thought you were going to throw out. That's a head spinner right there. My goodness.
Yeah. And as a pastor, I make nowhere close to $300,000 a year. Just there's no way. So I'm like, okay, what are we going to do? We got to figure this out. Like GoFundMe maybe. Like, no, let's be more creative. So I got this website that's now defunct, iwritetosavemywife.com. And I just started writing chapters of our story, our crazy story, and started sharing it online. I was like, okay, this is going to go viral. This has to go viral. Let's get it to Oprah because Oprah can write that check, right? Save me, Oprah. Like we need this so badly. And so that's how this whole project started. But it felt super overwhelming to me because it felt impossible. I actually was going through a lot of depression at the time, and that was rough. And I eventually just had to step away because people started reaching out to me from like weird pockets of the world, like Mexico City and Portugal and who knows where, like Asia. And they're like, hey, I came across, your story online. Like, can I tell you all the things about what's going on with me in my life? I'm overseas serving as a missionary and, I've got MS and blah, blah, blah. Like people would start to dump their stories on me. And I'm like, oh, no, I can't. I can't even deal with my story, let alone yours. And
sure.
All of it felt very overwhelming to me. So I gave up. I just stopped writing. I can't do this anymore. And I hated it because I'm the type of guy that wants to finish what he starts. That feels very important to me, but I just couldn't. I didn't have the gusto. So I gave up on it for a long time. And it wasn't until I went away and got some help for my depression that I was like, okay, maybe there's something in this that God has that's not raising money for Alicia's therapy. Thank goodness the insurance company changed their mind.
Thank God.
We won the approval process and she was able to get back on to IVIG and that was great. But it really felt like God was kind of poking at me that I needed to finish the book. So last year I just decided I'm going to pull this together. I'm going to make it happen. It was actually a really cool process. Like Stephen, I don't know if you've ever written anything like at all, but like the therapy of just writing. Oh my gosh.
Sure.
Yeah, it's the best.
Well, and I'm glad you mentioned that because I realized that something like this had to be incredibly cathartic for you to be able to just kind of dump out your brain, dump out your emotions. Yeah. I've met enough authors, I've talked to enough authors to know that the writing process is not a cakewalk by any stretch. And you add that this is so much into the depths of what it's been like for you dealing with this stuff with your wife. that takes it to a completely different level. While it can be therapeutic, it's also deeply personal, deeply revealing to some of the things that you have been through together. Is there a way for you to even explain what that process was like for you to put all those things onto paper, if you will, to make sure that that story is told?
Well, I'd like to think I'm a champion of authenticity. I share my story often. Whenever I get a chance to speak at a church or something, I'm always sharing my story and tying it in with scripture. I coach people through what I call the expectation gap. I'm sure we'll key in on that at some point, but every time I meet with someone new, we start with story. So I share my story and then I ask them to share their story. And I just believe that story is our greatest gift. It's a tool that we can use for evangelism, but it's a gift that we give other people, that, says, hey, I'm going to trust you with some vulnerable parts of my life. Yeah. And so, yes, I want to be about that, but actually putting it out on paper. And it was like, okay, I'm putting it on wax for all time. If I share something with you, like maybe you tell one or two other people, like worst case scenario, who cares, right? But when I put it out on wax forever, like it's out there. I can't go back. Yeah. And there were stories that I was like so emotionally distraught with. There were 2 times where my wife essentially died on me. There were traumatic moments, like moments that I've done counseling and like EMDR kind of therapy over, but still it's like gut wrenching to put out and to like give a play by play. Like, I just feel like, oh my gosh, I'm vomiting with this intensity. Like, who wants to read this? This is awful. And yet at the same time, I try to bring a ton of humor to the book. Like, my favorite reviews always say, oh my gosh, I laughed so much at this book and I never expected that because it's a book about suffering, right? Yeah. So it helped me to process through a few things. One, like, how can I not take myself too seriously? By trying to infuse humor, to try to infuse some perspective. And that was really good. Like, it takes some of the sting away from like those traumatic moments. But also, now that I'm done with it, I can see the thread of how God has been working through all of this. I mean, 15 years of intense suffering. I don't know how my wife is still alive. Like, it's an absolute mystery to me. Objectively, she should not be around still, but she is. And I can see how God has worked in the small and in the big. And gosh, I come away from this experience of writing and sharing, and I'm so grateful. Like, my gratitude is the end result of this process of writing. Like, I can celebrate every angle of this at this point. Now, maybe tomorrow will be a different story because, something new happens. But I actually think that the process has equipped me, not just given me like retrospective gratitude. It's also equipped me for the potential of disaster. Sure. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. Because I'm thinking about, from my listeners, Jim and I went back and forth quite a bit in DMs and Instagram just before we got this conversation going. And something that you said that I thought was so impactful and kind of was the deal sealer for me is something that you said, that you would have never wished this on your marriage, on your relationship, on your wife. And yet here you are 15 years later, and as twisted as it may sound to somebody, you understand. You totally understand where it has brought you. And I'm going to assume it's brought your wife to a similar place with where the two of you are in your own strong marriage, as well as just where each of you are in your faith.
Yeah, no doubt. So to the point of this coaching thing, like, this is my ministry. I've worked in churches for about 10 years, and I loved working in the church world. It was a great environment for me. But at the end of the day, felt like putting on the show every Sunday just was a little dissatisfying. Like we great things were happening on Sunday morning. I don't want to take anything away from that, but where I've seen more fruit in my life is being able to share my story with a guy and him share his story and him invite me into what I call the expectation gap, his suffering, and allowing me to walk, side by side with him. And that act alone has just given me so much life. And when I decided to leave church work, it was like, okay, I think this is what God's calling me to. I don't really have a context. I don't know anyone else out there that's an expectation gap coach. Like, this is something I think I've made up.
You started your own niche.
Yeah, it's great. You know, like, I think God really gave it to me. And then God went one step further and was like, hey man, I want you to give this away for free. Like, don't charge anyone. Like,
Wait,
okay,
what?
that makes sense. Yeah. Like, please don't make me do this. I actually went to Alicia and I said, hey, I think God's like telling me to give this away, like to not charge anyone. That's stupid, right? You don't agree with that, right? Like, I wanted her to say no for
get her
me.
to back you up.
Oh my gosh. So I could then say, God, I'm sorry. I have to honor my wife also.
Yes.
Like, I want to honor
and you told me to do that.
Yes. But she was like, no, totally. I'm 1,000% on board. Please don't charge anyone. Like, how does that make sense? Like, we can't afford our life to begin with. Like, I'm going to give this away, but it's been great. Like, honestly, over the last couple of years, I've coached over 150 people. I've not charged anyone. We've been able to make it every single month. Like, her and I are like lockstep in the case for our ministry. And
right.
I'm so thankful for it. Like, I keep saying, like, I'm so sorry. I'm like a valley girl up in here. Here's the thing, Stephen, I hate how sick my wife is. It's the worst. It is the thing that defines my life in all the wrong ways. But I don't know if at this point, if God came to me with an offer, all right, I'll heal your wife, but you can't do this ministry anymore.
Oh, wow.
I don't know if I would take that deal. I want her healthy, like, more than anything, but I just see like the ways that God has used every part of this. So yeah, her support and her desire to use, this suffering for the sake of God's kingdom. Yeah, right. It's amazing. I want to do that.
Well, I'm very curious about the term that you use in that expectation gap. If we could just kind of pick that apart a little bit, just especially as how it applies to yourself and thus how you're working with other people kind of within that framework, especially where this has got to play in, and that what you were thinking when you got married and had a very dim view of your future, this probably was nowhere near anything what you expected.
Of course. Yeah. Great question. So yeah, when I was getting married, like, man, I was so madly in love with Alicia. I thought that her and I were just going to take the world, we were going to have a ton of kids. Both of us were going to have, big time jobs, make a ton of money, travel all over the place, just have this really amazing life. And then 3 months after we got married is when she got sick and just life fell apart. So my hopes and expectations, I would like to say they weren't high. I would like to say that they were reasonable. I don't know. I don't know how to quantify that, but reality came in far underneath my expectations.
Well, and it came in fast. So goodness.
Fast. Yeah.
Wow.
Like, I was not prepared for any part of it. And so this expectation gap is a place where we find disappointment and dissatisfaction and distress. And I've felt every part of that. Like, I don't know how to deal with this at all. Like, I shut down in so many ways. I isolated. I became depressed. I couldn't cope with any part of this. Like, no one's ready for an expectation gap of this size. But sure. I felt like people at my church, shout out to Quest Church in St. Louis. I know you're in the Lou.
I am.
I'm no longer there. I'm in Colorado, but people there rallied beside us, and they like stood next to us and held our arms up when we were weak and weary. And it made a monstrous difference in our lives. They basically said, "Hey, we're going to experience victory together." And I'm so grateful for what they did. It's as if, Moses on the side of the mountain has his arms up in the air in victory pose, and he's not strong enough. His own strength isn't strong enough to keep himself into victory pose. And so Aaron and Hur have to invite themselves in, and they themselves get into victory pose to keep him in victory pose until the battle is won.
Sure.
And so that's what I get to do now. I felt like at the time God was like, hey, are you paying attention? because the church is actually doing the job of the church here. And eventually God kept reminding me and poking me to go into ministry. And I was like, sweet goodness, Father, like there's no way I'm going to go into ministry. Like if you look at the complicated life you've given me, like ministry is supposed to be complicated. If you're doing it well, it's going to be complicated.
It's
and
messy.
That's just,
Yep.
It's too much. So I resisted him every turn and every step. And yet he continued to pursue me in it. So I don't know if that answered any part of your question. I can't even remember what you asked me at the beginning there.
No, I think that's it, just being able to dive into what the expectation gap had to look like in your life, especially where it motivated you to pen this book. I'm just guessing that that disappointment level, as quickly as it came and as monstrous as it came, had to be its own education for you, and that you are now an expert medically, perhaps unlike someone who has never even heard of this condition, to where you could probably speak at symposiums about it. Especially, how many surgeries is it that your wife has had?
You know, we used to keep track and we lost count. It's north of 36. We were several dozen in. It's been horrific. We used to keep track of how many nights I was in the hospital. It's hundreds. We've spent over a year in the hospital. These 2 near-death experiences were horrific. I've learned a lot about the medical system.
Yeah, I bet.
I've learned a lot about, what it takes to overcome in a lot of different ways. And that's not the expertise I wanted. I would have loved to been an expert at sports. Let's break down some basketball, right? The NBA playoffs are on. Let's figure that out. Yeah. I would have loved that, but this is what God's given me, Well,
even in that lowered, no, that's not the word I'm looking for. That expectation that was nowhere near your radar, the suffering that you've talked about. That's a topic that I have tried to address here on this podcast a time or 2 or 3, because I feel like we do the watching world a terrible disservice when we portray our faith as bright and rosy and sunny and full of pixie dust and unicorns. But we hurt and we deal with really hard stuff just like anybody else. But give me a choice of going through this with Jesus or without him. There's no question. I'm just going to go ahead and assume that, I mean, I've listened to a little bit of the podcast that you had before, just breaking down scripture. This Bible stuff means something to you. All of this. Yeah. Where would you be without God, without your own faith through this 15-year journey?
Gosh, I'm already a small-time wreck, at least. Probably a medium to large-size wreck, if I'm being honest. I can't imagine not having Jesus on this ride. Truly, if I didn't have Christ, I wouldn't still be married. I'd be addicted to something. I shudder even to play that out, like what life would look like. It would be so dissatisfying. I mean, talk about expectation gap. I would have just built a larger expectation gap for myself, trying to cope and to deal. Yeah,
exactly. And I think that's where, just having had a discussion with a friend of mine this week about just some stuff that he's got going on personally, and the term that he used, and I'm sure it's come from somewhere bigger, but learning to embrace the suck. And that may sound a little bit self-deprecating, but I think that there's still some truth in it, that God allows us to go through these things. I think if only to show how much we need him. And
That's right.
Even when you think you know how much you need him, you're still just scratching the surface on how desperate our lives would be without him. I'm just curious in that, what have you learned about understanding that your suffering has purpose, even when it seems like you may be just completely alone with a million questions?
Absolutely. I'm so glad you asked that. I think there's a real theology to suffering. I think for us as humans, especially as Americans, we are self-sufficient enough.
Yeah.
Like we can do decent enough and take care of ourselves well enough, provide for ourselves decently. Like all this stuff, we can just get by. It's not until the suffering comes that we realize we actually aren't good enough to get ourselves through.
Oh, sure.
Not 100% of us are currently suffering, but 100% of us will suffer. And if we don't have a better theology of suffering, man, us as the church, we are going to suffer. Like,
yeah,
I know I just used like the same word in the definition, but like we are going to pay a huge price.
Sure.
So the thing you said, like suffer with Jesus, is the entire like application of the book. So the book's called The Suffering Guy. And to give away the ending, I'm not the suffering guy. I'm a suffering guy. Yes. My wife, Alicia, she's a suffering gal, but Jesus is the suffering guy. No one has suffered more than him. He suffered so much to die for us on the cross. Like we just watched the Passion of the Christ for Easter, and I forgot how gory it is. It is the most horrific thing, and it probably realistically undersells how terrible it was.
Yeah.
Jesus is the suffering guy. And there's this great verse in Romans 8 that says that we are adopted by God. And I love that. I want to be adopted by God. Like the adoption story is so beautiful and so right. And it says that we will then be heirs with Christ. And I'm like, oh my gosh, yes, I want the full inheritance that Jesus is getting. I know I want to sit at the right hand, but frankly, I want to be on the throne. Like I want the inheritance that Jesus has coming. But the verse doesn't stop there. I hate that the verse doesn't stop there. They should put the period and just get rid of the rest.
Yep. The end.
But the verse, it'd be great. I'm all about it. It'd be a really easy theology for me. But the theology really enters here where it says, provided that we suffer with Christ.
Yeah.
And I'm like, dang, for real? To the point of 100% of us will suffer. Like we are all going to go through something. And it's a matter of, are we going to suffer with him or without him?
Right.
And those are your options. We can't really choose much in our life. Like we don't have that much control, but we can choose our response. So is our response going to be to suffer with him or without him?
Right.
And suffering with him is always better. And suffering with him is going to give us this inheritance. It's going to give us everything. Like everything is on the line. And here's the thing that messes with my head, Stephen, like struggling with, church work and just like, what are we doing? I think that us as believers, we struggle. We always say, oh my gosh, I can't wait for Jesus to come back. Like, I just want to be with him. It's going to be so great. Like I'll be in the choir, like whatever it takes. Like, I just cannot wait to be in heaven. But I don't know. The last time I checked, like the only way to get to heaven is death and tribulation.
Yep.
Right. I can't think of any other paths. So if that's what it takes to get there, we've got to suffer well. And I think the church, the people in the church, like, non-Christians looking at Christians, they see us as hypocritical. Yeah. I think this is why, because we claim this hope of Christ, but the moment suffering happens, we fall apart. We just like shut down and we give up and we seemingly walk away from our faith. And it's like, but I thought you were pumped about heaven.
Yes.
Weren't you excited about getting there? Like, are you kidding me?
How did your story change so fast?
Yeah. So we prove ourselves by how we respond in suffering. It's the only way. It's the only way for us to say, yes, Lord, like you are actually in control and I trust you. Mm-hmm. Everything else we can just kind of skate by and it's fine. We're good enough. Yeah. We need suffering in our lives. And trust me, I don't want the suffering in my life. Like, please take it away, Lord. Like I'll pray that prayer. But I also have to be thankful for the suffering that he allows me to endure and frankly helps me to endure.
Right.
Because I'm doing it with him.
Well, especially when you've arrived at a point like this, that obviously I don't think that you would claim some sort of superiority in it, but you've arrived at this point when you can see how God is going to take that and use it, and he's going to use you to help others to speak well into their suffering, to speak well into whatever dark days they are dealing with. I love that you say that you've injected humor throughout that I'm going to assume it's not just to be tongue in cheek, but in truth, it's like, unless you find some humor in all that, you may jump off a bridge. That there's got to be a albeit strange reward in realizing God is using you because of the suffering. And it's a hard line to cross, to say that means more to me than I can quantify for you. But that's an amazing place to be in God's will.
It is. I don't even know how to respond to that, because I want to stay humble in this. Like, this has nothing to do with me.
Sure.
I'm not overcoming this. I'm maybe accepting it. I don't think I'm resigning myself to it. I think it's something more. It's something better. It's an understanding that, like, this is temporary. Like, scriptures talk about temporary affliction, and it sounds so messed up.
It does.
I mean, so messed up. Consider it joy and rejoice, and they're temporary afflictions. Like, oh my gosh, no, this is real.
Talk to me about temporary in the last 15 years.
Yeah, like, you don't understand how real and like long-standing this is, but there's something about long suffering that actually creates beauty. Like, okay, so let me paint this picture. Alicia, so I call myself the suffering guy, and we've already established that, but no one I think that I know has suffered more than Alicia. Like, obviously Jesus is the suffering guy, and I never experienced that, but I've experienced every part of Alicia's suffering. And she falls asleep. She can't even stay asleep all that long, but she just whimpers in pain. Like, the pain is so real, and she's on pain medication. She's got a management plan to help her with the pain, but it doesn't really cut through. It's so horrific. And so all this pain that she carries, that's so real. And yet she is the most alive and ferocious believer that I know. She by far is. And I think about the other people that I know that are going through hard suffering. I don't know if you know who Jay and Catherine Wolfe are. They wrote this great book called Hope Heals, and I've gotten to know them a little bit.
I have heard of the book now that you say that. Yeah.
Yeah. Catherine had this brainstem aneurysm and should have died, and she's half paralyzed and very compromised. Now I
know for sure I've heard that.
Oh my gosh. If you ever hear her speak, she's so ferocious. She loves Jesus with everything. And she, at some point in her speech, will like get up out of her wheelchair. And it's this huge moment, and it's full of so much life and hope and optimism and anticipation. And I'm like, okay, Alicia's this way and Catherine's this way. And, then everyone else that I hang out with, like, just, it's fine. Like, life's just kind of fine. Yeah. But it's this great suffering that we go through that can redefine something excellent. That I'm so glad I've got a view into it. I don't know if I like fully get it yet. I'm really working hard, but let's have some humor. Let's celebrate. Let's find gratitude for what is real in our lives. Let's not let the expectation gap crush us. Sure. It's easy to do, but let's not.
Right. And I think it's difficult for people to grasp that until they have been through something with that much gravity. You saying what you just said helped me recall my mother passed away from cancer in 2007 after about a 15, 18-month, brutal battle. And we have such strangely fond memories of after she had entered into the hospice system and her mind was going a little bit, but some of the things that she said that we couldn't help but laugh, were truly wonderful times. It's like, if as brutal as this is, I'm sitting here watching my mother die day by day, that God actually allowed me to have very short moments of joy in those times where I could somehow kind of scooch my arms around behind her in her bed and just hug her in the middle of a laugh that I wouldn't trade for $1 million right now. That's a level that most people just, I agree with what you said. Maybe they just haven't had to deal with that yet. Is that something that you hope to give them a glimpse into with a book like this? That, yeah, suffering sucks. But if we allow it to teach us, if we allow God to work within those times, or if we just allow ourselves to fall into his arms when we don't know what else to do, that we can embrace it.
Yeah. Stephen, there's such a teaching in suffering. There's no teacher like suffering in our lives. It comes in and it infiltrates every part of us. And the response that we have will teach us one way or another. We can walk a pathway towards hope, or we can walk a pathway towards hopelessness. Yeah. And we can be taught either way. But there's a clear pathway of endurance and building character that lands us in a place of hope that is undeniable. So I hate that you had that experience, because it's so painful. I actually just lost my dad last month to stomach cancer. He went from diagnosis to death within 3.5 weeks.
Oh my! I am so sorry for your loss. Wow.
Well, I appreciate that. I echo the things that you're talking about. We had perspective. We had some intensity to share all the good memories and have these special moments. And like, as much as it's profoundly hard, those days were actually really sweet.
Oh yeah. And you'll never forget them.
I will never forget them. Yeah. Not at all. If I forget them, man, I shudder to think about forgetting them.
Right. I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't ask you to give some perspective as your wife's spokesman here in this situation to say a little bit about where she is now. Where would you kind of put her on a scale of things? And obviously there's a whole lot of ground to cover in 15 years, and you've talked about her being stable in the now. But can you talk just a little bit about where she is, her physical health? You already said she's a very positive and psychotic person as far as her faith, and that's amazing. But, just to kind of give a summary of where is Alicia right now?
Well, before I answer physically, I'll reiterate, spiritually, she is on fire and nothing's holding her back. Every time she can tell I start to get fearful, every time I have this perspective of like, oh my gosh, this is the last month, this is last week, like you're not going to survive much longer. She's like, hey, God's not done with me yet. Like, I can tell you that for sure. He's got more in store for me, and you can be as fearful as you want, but I'm not fearful. And I love that. Like, she doesn't just believe it. She, like, in her guts, her broken guts, believes it. It's like, it's really impressive. But physically, man, the pandemic's been hard. So Alicia has got a really small world. She can't drive. She can't work. She is trapped on the couch for most of her days if she's not getting out for, therapy or a doctor's visit, sometimes the occasional like salon visit or whatever. But like truly, she's stuck on the couch. And the pandemic made her already small world that much smaller. And I hate that for her. I'm so glad it feels like we're coming out of it, but it's almost like hard to believe that.
Yeah, exactly.
One level, she was really thankful. She's been wearing masks for years because of her, condition. She needs to be careful of germs. So she felt like she was part of the crowd now. She became so cool wearing a mask. But I would say, for her right now, it is about finding ways to connect with people despite the pain, despite the limitations. And I think that's why she's so animate about me doing this ministry. And she was insistent that I wrote this book. She was not going to let up on any of this. Like, you need to do it. So she's a little bit living vicariously through me, which I don't know if that's cool or messed up. But, we're really close. We talk about everything. We're so open, and she takes a lot of joy out of what I'm able to do, because we're able to do it together. She makes it possible, and she's such a good mom. We have a little boy, which that part didn't even enter into the scenario here.
Yeah, I know we didn't even scratch the surface on that thing, but golly.
Yeah. God did an absolute miracle in our lives. Like, we had no business being parents. It was impossible for her to get pregnant or carry a pregnancy, and yet God did a miracle. And that's found in the book. I'm not going to get lost in that story, but she's a really good mom, and she engages our now 11-year-old son really well. And it's hard because she's limited as a mom, but she's also a way better mom than anyone else I know at the same time. So that's what life's like right now.
But it sounds like you two are incredibly united in purpose under that same umbrella of just knowing that it's hard, but God's got you in it. Period.
Yeah. We've got no control. Like, control's a farce.
Yeah,
we talk about control a lot, but God's in control. He's the one that gets to have control. And Alicia and I are always checking in with each other about our responses. Like, how are you processing that? Like, that decision didn't seem to be consistent with who we say we are. Like, all of this is exceptionally important for us.
With this book specifically, is it possible for you to distill it to, somebody says, yeah, that looks interesting enough, but what do you hope that somebody walks away? Wow, I just sat through this book. I've read page after page of what you and your wife have been through. I know this is a Christian podcast. Everybody, the answer is Jesus. Hey, guess what? But ultimately, what is it that you're hoping people glean from this deep, deep story?
Yeah, great question. I hope that people find an encouragement to be suffering guys and suffering gals themselves, because their story, let me say it directly to the audience. Your story matters. And if you suffer well, at least decently well, like you don't have to have the pressure to do it perfectly. I don't even know what that looks like. Yeah. But if you suffer well, that's going to matter to someone else. And that's going to give you the ability to minister to them. This is all about discipleship. This is all about helping someone grow in their understanding and their own walk, their ability to celebrate in the midst of a hard, broken life. Like, it is the gospel message that we all stand on one side of the cavern, the giant, expanse between us and Jesus. And there's only one way across it. And we have to be suffering guys and suffering gals. And I love what you said earlier, embrace the suck. Yeah. It actually doesn't have to suck. That's what I want people to understand, is that, yes, it's going to suck. It's going to be far from your ideal. It's going to be full of expectation gaps. But there's so much to be thankful for in what is real, and you can find that. You can build that bridge over to Jesus and truly suffer with him. So maybe I'm just rehashing everything that I've already said, but that's really what I want people to walk away with, is like, I can do this, and I'm probably going to have to.
If you are a longtime listener of this show, you've probably heard me mention before how grateful I am for the connections that I have been able to make. Add Jim Barnard to that list. I was late for dinner the night that we recorded this because we just kept finding more things to talk about. And not to give too much away, but don't be surprised when you find Jim back on this show as a repeat guest. Check the show notes for a link to Jim's website where you can get more information about him and Alicia. And please check out his book. I believe that you will be pleasantly surprised at just how much it will encourage you. Make sure that you are following this show on your favorite podcast app. I have got some really great episodes coming over the next several weeks. And now may the Lord bless you and protect you. May the Lord smile on you and be gracious to you. And may the Lord show his favor and give you peace. And I will catch you here next time in the Nook.
The Nook Podcast is a production of Sozo Digital Media.